Let's talk about fear. More than just talk. Let's face it. Hi, this is Michael Shevack, and welcome to Godsearch. If you're alive, you are already on what I'm calling a God search. It's a search for goodness, and that goodness includes unity, and that goodness includes the correct use of your supernatural technological abilities so that your actions and the actions in life, your motions, life's motions, harmonize and they move together and associate together so we get a more fluid, harmonious life with less resistance and more of a sense of a unified wholeness to life. This is the spiritual experience that everyone is talking about, and which is why so many traditional religions are losing populations and others are increasing and exploring new spiritual arts because this experience is real. I'd like to talk about what is, I would say it's the enemy on the God search path. Now, the word enemy, put it in quotation marks because the minute you call something an enemy, you have ceased to include it in unity. And the minute you include something, exclude something from unity, it's no longer unity. So the very fact that you would declare something to be an enemy of a spiritual path causes difficulties on that spiritual path. This is the incredible irony around the idea of unity. So, nonetheless, it is, from a practical point of view, an enemy. When you have fear, inordinate fear, which can, in its extreme, paralyze you, and you do not know how to act. And you're no longer living in a harmonious alliance between yourself and the actions of your ego and the response of life and other egos around you. When you don't have that, the fear gets enormous. And the enormity of the fear also breaks that experience of harmony. They go hand in hand. The breaking of the harmony allows the fear to surface. And when the fear surfaces, it breaks the harmony. So, yes, from a practical point of view, fear can be seen as the enemy on the path. Let me tell you a little bit of a story. Um, in in the mornings, I used to go for a long, extended walk along a towpath. It was a path that had been put in place for mules to carry barges and deliver coal to be processed. And it now is a part of a public park, and I used to walk it. And I don't really know where the idea came from. Sometimes when you're on a God search, an idea can just bubble up and it takes you over, and you really don't know where it came from. You can't even figure it out. But I had this sudden idea that dawned on me to walk on this towpath with my eyes closed, as if I was completely blindfolded. And very strange idea. So fortunately, at that time in the morning, I was the only person around, and I could do that without, worrying what would happen if I stumbled or anything like that. But I basically closed my eyes and blindfolded myself and continued to walk. It was a straight line, and I kept walking and kept walking and kept walking. At a certain point, I froze in my tracks. It was like an ice pick had come into me and stabbed me. My body just was paralyzed. My eyes were closed. I didn't know why, but I just became paralyzed. I could not take one step. And I was very curious about why this was happening. I'm very much of a kind of experimenter. And I opened my eyes, and I am maybe 5 inches from the edge of a retaining wall that was supporting the towpath, and down below was 45 feet onto rocks. Now, something in me, with my eyes closed, in my body, sensed that I was in danger. My body had a sense that it was in danger and stopped me. It felt like my body. Some people might have said it was an angel or God speaking to you, but it felt like my body. And I stopped in my tracks and looked down, and I could have killed myself. Could have killed myself. Now, I thought about this because I have a little bit of a medical training, and I know that when children are born, they are born with an innate reflex of fear. If you don't support the bottom of the baby and the baby doesn't feel like there's something under them and it's just, empty space, they innately panic. It's the body of the baby knows what it needs to maintain its materiality. And what happens is the baby begins to panic and display absolute terror in order to attract attention, obviously, to keep the baby alive. So I realized that what had happened to me was a more adult, admittedly stupid, test of that very, very primal instinct. But the important thing about it was that I realized when it came to fear, I had to disavow some of the stuff that I learned in therapy and some of the stuff that I learned from studying certain mystical spiritual disciplines. I had to disavow that all fears are obstructions to greater illumination. Here was a fear that was automatic. My mind did not come in and create it. It was not neurotic. It wasn't like a fear of flying where you're afraid to get on the airplane, right? Or the first time you get behind the wheel of a driver, though that's really kind of a very, very natural fear because your body is not used to going 90 miles an hour, and you get the same kind of baby reflex to it. But you can have, let's say, the fear after a car accident. That's a neurotic fear, where you're afraid to get behind the wheel of a car. That's happened to me on two occasions. So I realized that there are some fears that preserve you, that not every fear is a psychological problem or a spiritual defense mode that is getting in place of higher advancement. Now, having said that, sure, fear of death can be an impediment in human beings towards higher development of higher states of consciousness that are beyond death. And that fear of death has to be faced in mystical initiation and spiritual development in a certain way, which is safe. So I understand that. Fear of hunger, of going hungry, is also something that people work on when they're looking for more monastic kind of experiences, which are less connected to the earth and more connected to, more cosmic experiences, because the hunger keeps you on the planet. Okay. The fear of death keeps you on the planet. These are things that are part of the vital aspects of a human being. So it is true, kind of, sort of, that fears can be obstructions to certain aspects of spiritual development. But the path here is not very, very monastic. The path here, when you're on Godsearch, is to have a good life here in the body. And in the body, while you're here, before you die, there are certain fears that are part of physical life, and they are important fears. They need to be paid attention to. Had I not paid attention to it, I would be dead. There are certain fears that are there to instruct you. Now, there are, as I said before, certain fears that are neurotic, that they don't instruct you. They are impediments. I know people who are afraid to date new ladies. Why? They had a divorce and they're a little bit of gun shy. I know people who are afraid to take jobs as food services, and restaurants, because when they were younger, they were mistreated by a boss and they considered that to be demeaning. There are lots of neurotic fears, and these neurotic fears, most of the time we can ignore them, or we dance around them and ignore what's causing us to get stigmatized. But oftentimes in the spiritual path, what happens is the spiritual power that is entering into the individual comes and pushes out a lot of these neurotic fears, a lot of these blocks to life that have become habituated into the individual, and they don't serve life. You see, that's the fundamental difference between what I'd call a real fear and a neurotic fear. In a real fear, the fear actually preserves life or death. It's real, okay? And it's there to help you. It's there to enhance life and preserve life. But in neurotic fears, these fears are there to preserve a belief in what's necessary to preserve life. You will be afraid of driving a car because you get in an accident. Therefore, not driving a car is a way of preserving you against your fear of driving the car. It's not there to enhance life. It's there to decrease the fear that's interfering with life. Do you see what I'm talking about? It's not serving that purpose. Now, some, of course, may say, well, if you're driving the car and you're nervous, you will be prone to an accident. And that's true, because if you feel that, it can affect you and it can affect your driving. So there is a subtle difference always between real fears and imagined fears. You have to look very, very carefully. When you're on a spiritual path, as I just said, there is a spiritual life force that enters into things. It's very palpable. When a student or a seeker begins to enter into the path, there is oftentimes some kind of moment of initiation. It can be, a student can have it directly with, life, around them. The student can get sparked by a certain book that they're reading, a teaching. Sparking is a nice term that they use in the Lubavitch Hasidic movement. It means all of a sudden there's a bang, like a total new paradigm shift, and spiritually something happens. You get ignited, you know. Um, Rudolf Steiner, who I really liked, called it being an initiate. All right, there is a kind of, um, you know, uh, darshan, where something sparks the individual and they begin to undergo a kind of spiritual change, like cells suddenly beginning to reproduce. And when that spiritual energy enters into you, it has a way of pushing all of the obstructions to itself out. So anything that is hiding in shadows, that is an obstruction to the embodiment of that force of spirit, shall we say, the incarnation of that spirit, will be pushed out, and those obstructions will become oftentimes conscious. They may float up and we may become aware of it, or they will stay unconscious. But what they will do is, through your subconscious mind, which is active and alive and very creative, you will produce events in your life where you have to live through incidents and problems that are the direct result of these things being pushed out. I knew certain people who went through 2 and 3 relationships with a lady who looked remarkably like a very, very deranged mother that the person happened to have. It took 2 or 3 relationships for the person to work through some of the terrible fear cycles that had been installed in their programming. But this happened when the student decided to seek a power that was greater than what they thought they should be as men, and seek a power which was more profound and more illumined kind of feminine than the most powerful person in their childhood. So it began to open up events in their lives where they met people and they worked through and walked through different paths in order to move through the emotional complexes that were holding the personality back and entrenched in a very, very early stage of development. This is what happens when there is an initiation and a sparking, and the individual is drawn to that. Oftentimes, what happens is these fears, when they are sparked and they are brought to the surface because you become aware of it and because it was hidden before, what happens is they are more pronounced. It's a very, very funny thing. And, I'm very fond of him. It was Sri Aurobindo, the great Hindu philosopher, said, you can get along very, very easily in life, very easily in life until you ask for some kind of illumination and knowledge of God before you ask to have the experience called God. That's how I phrase it here on Godsearch. He said, because the minute you ask for that, there is a force that enters into you and you are not permitted to resist what you've asked for. Obviously, you can't, because if you've asked for it, the impediments to receiving it will be pushed out for you to clean up so that you could have what is by nature yours naturally and spiritually, because that's how the world operates. It's a desire, and desires seek their fulfillment very easily and naturally. You'll discover this as you meditate more. As I said, meditation is a very, very wonderful tool for unifying the different aspects of your mind. So you'll notice that when you first desire to have an experience called God, that power comes and it will push out all of the obstructions to its path. It doesn't happen initially. Sometimes you get just the opposite. You will ask for that and you get this enormous flurry of incredible events that are happening synchronously and with an amazing force and power that is hard to believe. You'd call it a miracle. You'd call it living in grace or providence. You could call it many, many, many things. And oftentimes that is the first reaction that happens when you kind of download a spiritual force beyond you. It's like, yeah, you want it here, bang. And you're opening it up with so much sense of faith that you're not aware of the obstructions. And then that oftentimes will plateau, and then you will be brought back down to earth. And then there's a little dirty work and cleanup to do. Handling your fears in a systematic way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As they surface, you face them. As you face them, you unveil what is it that they have power over inside you. What is it that they have power over inside you? What are they controlling you and forcing you to be or do? And what would happen if you removed that control? What is the spiritual gift? What is your true spiritual personality that would open up? And how much deeper and more profound would be your experience called God if you opened that up? This is how you approach fear. You approach it. I know this is not an easy thing to take because fear is one of the most unpleasant feelings you can have. But the way to approach fear is excitement. First, you distinguish between a real fear and a neurotic fear. It is a real fear that if you don't have enough air, you're going to die. Okay? And even if you're a super yogi that can be buried for a while and only take tiny amounts of air to sustain life, Sooner or later, when the air is used up, your body is going to die. There is a natural fear. That's a real fear. However, a fear that if you don't have 15 extra dollars, you're going to wind up starving. Well, that's not a real fear. That's a conditioned fear. No one eats money. Money is not edible. You can go into any public park, and with the knowledge there's plenty of food growing around, even in the winter, you can sustain life. But because we're so dependent on the economic system, we have a lot of neurotic fears around money and dependencies in human relations. And that's why money is one of the most marvelous ways to face fears and grow on your spiritual path. They force you into service to people, motivations, proper relationships, healthy exchanges, and they allow you to participate in a giant community-based enterprise called the economy, and even a nationwide, worldwide enterprise called the economy. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing to do. But if you take your fears and you treat them as excitement and the challenge, because you know that underneath the fear is a pocket of potential, a pocket of a side of yourself that you're not drawing on, and a pocket of knowledge that you can't access because it's been crusted over by this fear. And therefore, when you're on your God search, you get excited when in your spiritual path, which is nice and orderly, you come face to face with a fear that isn't real, that doesn't sustain life, and that has to be decommissioned, meaning you have to pull it out, you have to look at it, you have to reprogram yourself. Sometimes you have to deprogram yourself, and you have to lose its hold over you. It's no different than someone who, when they enter into their God search, they will get to a certain point where they may not be able to smoke cigarettes anymore, or they may have to, curtail some of their alcohol or other chemical dependencies. It's that the force of the life force that enters when you enter into a God search is very, very powerful. And anything which poisons its ability to release you to greater potential as a human being, well, it has to be, winnowed away. That's how spirituality works. So when you have a fear that begins to surface, it's always good to remind yourself that that fear is being brought to you because in this world, which is organized to create greater goodness, greater experience of unity, and a greater harmony between your actions and the activity of the world, that fear is being brought to you because you are being guided, you are evolving, and you are being asked to strip away this fear, which is like an idol. It's like a false god, which is grabbing your attention and pulling it away from what is good and productive and holy and spiritually energizing, spiritually elevating, you see. So these fears are to try to replace the negative feeling of fear with a positive feeling when fear comes. It's kind of the difference between a soldier and a warrior. A soldier throws his body into a war and overcomes his fear and takes that hill, pushes his body against his fear, and he commands him to do it in spite of his fear. A warrior doesn't do that, especially in a more Asian way. A warrior opens to the fear. The fear becomes a gift to expand the air that's entering their cells, to expand the reach of the neurons, like little tentacles reaching outward. The fear becomes an energizer. It becomes a positive challenge that releases the true potential of an individual. That's what's marvelous about fear. Now, it's very significant. All of this is very spiritual stuff. But it's very significant for me that in the Hebrew Bible, so Christians relate to that as Old Testament. They're a little different, but they're fundamentally the same. The term for fear of God, Yirat Adonai, is the same term for awe, A-W-E. The awe of God, meaning God is so marvelous and so unbelievably powerful that in that presence, compared to that presence, one feels awestruck. And that's the top side of the tapestry. You may remember we talked about that. The top side of the tapestry is the pretty, picture or scene that the tapestry has woven into it, and it's very beautiful. But the bottom side of the tapestry are the knots and the strings and the pulls and the dirt and all these little things that have been tied in the bottom. And it's a mess. You can still discern the pattern, but it is a mess. The bottom side of the tapestry is all the human emotions and the human fears and our fears of mortality and our fears of pain and suffering that intermingle in our experience of life. This spiritual experience as a human being has that stuff in it. So at first we can be overwhelmed when we seek on a God search, the presence of that experience, and we can feel awe when we begin to touch it, and our ego is in its correct mortal place, and we sense its immenseness compared to our tininess, and there's an awe. And that's the top side of the tapestry. But the bottom side of the tapestry is that the awe can be felt as fear, meaning I'm tiny, I'm vulnerable. It's much bigger than me, and I can't fully 100% control that. Because even if, as some religions would like to believe, we are God, and to a great extent, I would have to say we all are on some level. Even if we are, we're not all God, and we don't control ourselves individually every tiny nuance that takes place in life. So we can feel small, we can feel tiny, we can feel vulnerable. And our human side, no differently than a baby who splays their hands and feet when no one is supporting him, we can feel that degree of terror. It's a good thing to feel that. By the way, please go to yourgodsearch.com, and share some of your experiences with fears. You will find that you're not alone. Everyone seems to go through this. It is part of human spiritual experience, right? But the feeling of the fear and the recognition of the fear begins to take away its power. The feeling of the fear, the facing of the fear, is the beginning initial step where you say to the fear, you don't have any power here. There's no power in Munchkinland. No power here in Munchkinland. By the way, go to yourgodsearch.com. Sorry, an extra plug. And there's a book there, if you're interested, called Soul Lessons from the Wizard of Oz, How to Follow Your Yellow Brick Road. The story is astonishingly profound when you see it from a spiritual point of view. So go to the website and get yourself a copy. You might find it interesting. But you have no power here in Munchkinland. The point is that when you begin to have your initial spiritual experiences, it is important to feel the fear, acknowledge the fear. Know that the fear is that. Stop hiding from the fear, and also have the deep, abiding bubble of hope that in your heart, that it has no power, in Munchkinland, because you have left the black and the whiteness and the grayness and the dankness and flatness of canvas, and you're in a place that is more beautiful and has color and all sorts of stuff. So yes, fear can be your enemy on the path. If you have tremendous fears, let's say, of organized religion, that very fear of organized religion can stop you from experiencing a sublime spiritual experience through organized religion. You will not let yourself have it because you won't want to dignify the organized religion. You won't want to give them any credit, and therefore you will program yourself not to have a spiritual experience in organized religion if you have that fear of organized religion because you may have been hurt or because you picked up certain opinions that are very, very popular these days. So, fears can stop you from, they can be your enemy on the spiritual path. Depending on how you believe, you will conceive and achieve. As it says in I think it's Proverbs, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. So yes, the enemy, though, that is fear, well, once you begin to treat it spiritually, you begin to notice that the fear is also your best friend. The more you open to it, confront it, and unveil the power underneath that it is blocking you from. And once you realize that the fear is often there to prevent you from misusing a power that's in you that you've been afraid to use. Well, once you realize that, you'll notice that as your spiritual path develops on your God search and you confront the fear that is brought along your path and you unveil its hidden gift, that enemy that was obstructing you on the path, that is trying to be pushed out so that you can, be aware of it and let it go, that enemy is a friend. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a life where your devils are angels in disguise. You're talking about your angels sometimes being devils in disguise. You're talking about the fact that something that feels painful and frightening to your mere humanness, to the underside of the tapestry, is a magnificent contributor to the learning and the knowledge and the spiritual magnificence, the spiritual magnificence of everyday life. That your very fears are the stuff that are the knots of your mortality, fears of life, fears of death, fears of pain, fear of pleasure, fear of hunger, fear of overeating. They're just opposites. And those form the knots and the strings under the tapestry, which is overall there to say life is beautiful, you are beautiful, and your potential to weave a magnificent picture and create a beautiful life is enormous. So, embrace your fears. You don't have to love them in a way where you're going to keep them around forever. Keep around the real fears, the ones that would stop you from getting killed, like my story. But all the other ones, you don't need them. They're vagrants. They're taking up space. They're camping out in your living room, and you really don't need them. Be open to removing the fears, one fear at a time. Usually when you get on your God search, it's a very organized process and you will not get overloaded. They usually come to you one step at a time, and you can nicely unknot each in a very, very organized way. At one last point, oftentimes you'll notice that the same fear will mirror in different aspects of your life. So when you get a download of spirit and it begins to push out these things that may go wrong, you will notice, if you look very carefully, that if there's a problem at work, a problem at home, a problem with a girlfriend or boyfriend, there'll be a problem with a marriage, a problem, in the community, and all these things that are happening to you. If you look very closely at them, you will see that oftentimes it's a flurry of events, but below the surface, they are the exact same fear in disguise. It oftentimes happens that when you have to, strip away the power of a fear over your life, it comes to you in multiple sources at multiple times to draw your attention to it. Oftentimes, the deeper the fear, the more exaggerated the events that come to you, and the greater the number of events that come to you, because the deeper the fear, the more the life evolutionary process in a God search, which you'll discover it's there, will push you and force you to get your awareness to deal with it. Okay, that's how it works. It's thematic. You'll oftentimes see thematic fears that arise, and they play themselves out in multiple events. It's good work. So anyway, thanks for joining me. This is Michael Shevack again. You're on Godsearch, so please uncover God, discover God, and recover God. Take back your fears and turn them from fear of God to awe of God, because the more you undo the knots and the strings that are under your tapestry, the more you'll see that you are in a magnificent reality, and you will experience God. More greater goodness, greater unity, and greater harmony between your actions and the motions of life around you. This is Michael Shevack. Thanks for being here. Wednesday, 5:45 Eastern Daytime. It's always great to share my heart with you. Thank you for being there. I rely on you. It keeps me whole, gives me a purpose to life. All right. Bye-bye.